I am Dr. John Douglas, and it was my privilege to lead the medical team that cared for General Grant during the last year of his life. Now, perhaps you expect me, as a medical man, to talk about the condition that claimed him, about the modern medicine that we employed to try to prolong his life. Well, I'm not going to talk about that. What I am going to talk about is something more important, in my view. Every good doctor knows that a patient's well-being does not rely solely on medicine. It relies, and I hope I don't embarrass you with this, it relies on love. A family's love as the afflicted person struggles during his last days. That love makes the struggle less horrible. I'm not quite sure how to phrase it. Maybe just more bearable. And in the case of Ulysses Grant, what I saw when he was with his family moved me very much, and I began to think, while most of the world knows the public man, the world does not know this private man, and it should. It should. So what I want to do in my few minutes here is to tell you some stories that I heard, overheard. These moments, I think, tell you as much about Ulysses Grant as anything you read in the war journals about his generalship. I want to begin with a story the general told himself. This occurred when the general was still in good health. He was living in New York City. He was going to be the guest of honor at a banquet somewhere in Midtown. And to go to the banquet, he left his home on, I'm sure I can remember it, East 66th Street near Central Park, and began walking downtown. He had an umbrella with him because he knew it was going to rain, and sure enough, it did start to rain. And in front of him was a gentleman who did not have an umbrella. So General Grant accelerated his pace, put the umbrella over the both of them, and they walked on. Two strangers sharing an umbrella. General Grant's not particularly talkative. This day was no different, but the man sharing the umbrella was talkative, and he talked the general's ear off. And then finally he said, "You know, tell you where I'm going. I'm going to this banquet where Ulysses S. Grant is going to be the guest of honor. He is a famous man, and I owe it to myself to see him in person. But between you and me, I think Grant is highly overrated." To which Ulysses S. Grant responded, "That is my view also." And it was. I am here to tell you that Ulysses Grant was genuinely a modest man. And when he said he thought other people overrated him, he meant it. He meant it. Now, I happened to be at the Grant apartment, again, this is in New York City, during the general's illness. He was not entirely debilitated yet, But he had two visitors at the same time. One was Mark Twain, who, as you know, will be publishing the General's book. And the other was another writer, a fellow named Lew Wallace, who you might recollect has written the bestseller Ben-Hur. Lew Wallace was a general during the war. He and Grant were together in the Western theater. Had a little falling out for a while, but by this point, were the best of friends. So, here's what you have. You have Mark Twain. Then you have the general's wife, Julia. Then you have Lew Wallace. And then you have the general. And Julia, the general's wife, standing between Mark Twain and Lew Wallace, says, "There is many a woman in America who would like to trade places with me now. Here I am standing between America's two finest authors." At which point, Mark Twain looked over at General Grant and said, "Oh, don't look so downhearted, General. I hear you're working on a book. You might amount to something someday." And General Grant laughed. This man, who is very dignified, had not lost the ability to laugh at himself. He was not offended by Mr. Twain making fun of him at all. That was an endearing quality that never changed in all the time I knew him. Many cards, letters, telegrams have come or had come to General Grant when word was spread of his illness. And one of the letters he received was from a fellow you may have heard of, named James Longstreet. Now, Longstreet is remembered as one of the foremost Confederate generals. What you might not know, and what I want to share with you, is how close Ulysses Grant and James Longstreet were. They were cadets together at West Point. Grant apparently was very shy and inhibited. Longstreet, very outgoing, very loud, and yet they hit it off. Now their temperaments were very different, and the general told me a little story that illustrated that. At West Point, it was understood that cadets at some point had to break curfew. During the night, when they were supposed to be in their barracks, it was an obligation for them to sneak out and get over the wall and then back onto the West Point campus without being caught by the sentries. Every cadet was supposed to do this. And woe be to them if they were caught, because they would get demerits. Here's how James Longstreet did that. He studied the moon, so he knew on which night there would be no moon. He watched the sentries, so he knew the pace at which they walked while on guard duty. He was able to study where in the wall and at what time of night no one was able to observe a brash young cadet tiptoeing out and going over. And then, at another hour, coming back. That is how Longstreet and most of the cadets got out of West Point without being caught. Here's how Ulysses S. Grant did it. He put on his best uniform. He got a pile of papers and probably a valise. Put the papers under one arm, the valise under the other, and he put a scowl on his face and he began walking rapidly to the front gate. And the look on his face said, "I dare anybody to stop me." And nobody did. He bluffed his way through, and he bluffed his way back. This shows you a little bit of the different temperaments of these two men. Now, they served together in the Mexican War, but before the war began, the American Army was, for a long time, camped in Texas, very close to the Mexican border. And because people were getting bored, the officers decided they would put on a play for entertainment. And Ulysses S. Grant and James Longstreet both starred in the show. And here are their roles. The play was Othello, and Longstreet played Othello, and Ulysses Grant played Desdemona, the female lead. He was clean-shaven then, by the way. To think of these two warriors on stage, it makes me smile every time I think of it, and it made Grant smile. And his friendship with Longstreet endured. They went their separate ways, as you know, during the war. But the second the shooting stopped, at Appomattox Courthouse, Grant had to work out the surrender terms with General Lee. And on the second day, he had to work out arrangements for the release of the Confederate prisoners. And who should walk in but James Longstreet? They had not seen each other since before the war started. And General Grant immediately remembered one of the favorite things they used to do at West Point when they were cadets and young. They played a card game called Brag. That was the general's, one of his favorite pastimes, playing cards. In any case, at this historic moment, Longstreet walks into the McLean residence. There is General Grant. And General Grant says to Longstreet, "Let's play a hand of Brag and remember the good days." Now, I go on about this to make this point. When Ulysses S. Grant made a friend, it was for life. It was for life. He was a very loyal man. And that is something to be wondered at, given the great divisions that this country has experienced. If someone wanted to remain his friend after the war, Grant embraced him. He told me a story about a lifelong friend of his named Daniel Ammon. Apparently, Daniel Ammon was a career naval officer. Ultimately, I'm sure he'll become an admiral because he's still in the service. But Daniel Ammon and Grant were boys together. They grew up together in Georgetown, Ohio. And when they were boys, they went fishing. And Grant fell into this creek that was in flood, and he was being washed down the down the stream. And Daniel Ammon ran along the bank, found a spot where the stream narrowed, and reached out and grabbed Grant as he was starting to go by and saved him from drowning. I think the boys were 8 or 9 years old. In any case, they were friends for the rest of their lives. And General Grant told me about a letter that he wrote to his friend Daniel Ammon. Apparently, the general had been talking to some cadets at West Point. This is when he was president, actually. And in his letter to Daniel Ammon, he said something like this: "It is now 50 years since you saved my life. I hold you responsible for all the pain and suffering I have endured since you saved me. I am, however, a forgiving man, and I will forgive you for saving my life. P.S. I doubt the Democrats will." General Grant had a sense of humor. He really, really did. I think I'll conclude my look at Grant the man by telling you about something that happened right here at Grant Cottage on the porch here. As you know, shortly before the general contracted his cancer, he was robbed of every dime that he had. He was overnight a pauper because the president of the bank where he kept his money was a thief. And the Grant family truly was broke. Many people around the country were willing to give them money to tide them over initially, but the Grants were very proud people. They would not take charity. However, they did accept some money when they got a letter from a stranger who lived in Troy, New York. This man's name was Charles Wood. And in the end, I think maybe there were 2 letters and 2 checks, but they totaled $1,500. And Charles Wood, who did not know General Grant at all, understood his psychology. He did not say in the letter, "I am giving this money to you." He said, "I am loaning this money to you, and I expect that I will be repaid." That General Grant could live with. And indeed, he would repay Mr. Wood. Now, Mr. Wood was a rich man, didn't care if he ever got the money back. He really had phrased it that way just so the general would take the money. Well, General Grant is here, sick, dying, and he would like to meet this man from Troy, who in his hour of need loaned him the money that saw his family through. So Charles Wood came here, and the general and he sat on this porch. The disease had progressed to such an extent that General Grant could not converse anymore. Perhaps he could whisper a few words, but what he did to maintain a conversation was to write notes. Charles Wood talked, General Grant answered with notes, and this went on for a time. I wasn't leaning over anyone's shoulder. I didn't really know what they were discussing. But after the meeting was over, Mr. Wood came to me with one of the general's notes, and he said, "I am going to keep this note for the rest of my life," because what the general had written included this phrase. And the phrase was, "While there is much unblushing wickedness in the world, there is a compensating grandeur of the soul." That General Grant, in the most dreadful of circumstances, fighting for his life, hoping to live long enough to finish his book so that if it's sold it would save his family from poverty. General Grant, who had been misled by the president of his bank, whom he had seen as a son Grant, who had seen much sorrow and bitterness and been betrayed by aspects of human nature, was still capable of seeing the good in people. That awareness never deserted him. He spoke of grandeur of the soul. And when I think of Ulysses S. Grant, my patient, the man I knew, the man I'm glad to tell you about, when I think of him, I know his was a grand, grand soul. And if you are looking for models for the future, you may look to him as a man of great talent, determination, modesty, humor. He had all the attributes of the very best of us. So, those are my memories of General Grant, and I know whenever I think of him, I will remember, and I know it's odd, the best moments of my life because I was with the best person I had ever met. Thank you.
I learned early on in my life that nothing is forever. When I was a child, I had a brother and sister die. When I was 11 years old, my father died. And when I was in my 20s, my beloved brother Henry died on the Mississippi River. That was a death, that was a loss that I never quite recovered from. When you lose so many people through death early on in life, there is no greater teacher that nothing is forever when you lose somebody you love. Now, when you understand that nothing is forever, you can either try to hold on to your life so tightly that you fool yourself into thinking that you can control the events of your life, or you can separate yourself. You separate yourself psychologically so that nobody ever really gets to know you. And the risk of you being exposed, and the risk of you losing someone that you have gotten close to becomes far less. I have spent most of my life psychologically distant because I was always afraid that I would not be able to tolerate the burden of one more loss. Not so long ago, I wrote a book about a young boy who stood in a church loft and observed his own funeral service. He had faked his own demise because he had this grand curiosity of what people might say about him when he was gone. And so he had faked his own demise. Now, on such occasions, during funeral services or memorial events, regardless of how you have lived your life, people find a way to say kind things about you. And so was the case for this young boy. Now, I am no analyst, although I have often acted as though I am one. I believe that young boy was me. And I will submit to you that each of us, somewhere buried in our psyche, in the unconscious self, we think about death often, and we wonder how we will be remembered. In the course of my life, I have lived as a trickster. I have been an illusionist. I have been a magician of sorts. I have used humor and wit, sarcasm, cynicism, my intellect, and even my white suit to keep me separate from people. I could slip in and out of their lives without anyone getting close. We will all die and leave this earthly experience at some point. That is a certainty. How our lives so certain. So today we gather to remember our dear friend Ulysses Grant. Ulysses was a dear man to me, and it is impossible for me to be the trickster with you today. It is impossible for me to create some illusion that separates me from this deep, deep sadness I am feeling. If you want to know what Samuel Clemens looks like when he is deeply saddened, you might look at me now. You may look at me now. I love Ulysses Grant, and I will miss him. And I will be anguished and blessed through the course of my life for having loved him. Now, Ulysses and I shared some things in common. We came from modest beginnings. And we loved our family very, very powerfully. Now, to love someone as powerfully as Ulysses has loved his family was high-risk behavior. He knew that should he lose a member of his family, it would cut deeper than any battlefield sword. Somewhere in Ulysses' childhood, and I am uncertain of how and where and when, he made a covenant with himself. That covenant he made with himself is that he would never, at any cost or at any price, surrender the virtues of humility, of courage, of kindness, and of resiliency. And in the course of his life, in his times of success and his times of failure, and he understood and experienced both, he never surrendered those virtues. Never. I am befuddled by the castigation and the criticism that my friend Ulysses experienced, most particularly in the course of his presidency, because he trusted too easily and too often. Now, in my imagination, as Ulysses makes his way and passage into and through the heavenly gates to the God of his life, I cannot imagine that his God would give him demerits because he trusted people. I would submit to you that the God of Ulysses would have commended him and said that the dark mark upon a person's character is not made on the person who trusts, but on the person who betrays a trust. Ulysses was a very, very kind man. When Ulysses was kind, it was because he was a kind man. When Ulysses was humble, it was only because he was a man of great humility. When Ulysses was courageous, it was because he was a man of great courage. Now, it is my understanding that only a few weeks ago, that some pilgrims from Mexico traveled to this very cottage to extend their best wishes and their gratitude to President Grant. These pilgrims sojourned so long and so far, and such a great testimony to this man. Ulysses S. Grant did not enjoy war. He anguished. It was always anguish. But purpose for Ulysses was greater than all. And so today, as I think of those sojourners from Mexico, and I think of those who fought with the Confederacy, who tipped their hats to Ulysses and the honorable life that he led, I will say my final farewell to my dear, dear friend, borrowing phrases from the Spanish language, from the Mexican people whom he loved, and they too loved him as well. No los olvidamos. Vaya con Dios, señor presidente. Buen trabajo. Buen trabajo. We shall never forget. Travel with God. Good work. Good work.
As many of you know, I am my father's only daughter. I was named Ellen Renshaw Grant after my maternal grandmother, although my family has always called me Nellie. My father and I were very close, and I always knew I had a particularly secure place in his heart. Today, on this day of celebrating his life, it is important for me to share my thoughts on my father. In order that I share them without my emotions overcoming me, I will endeavor to read them aloud. Growing up, I always felt surrounded by affection and attention. Doubtless, my father is remembered as General Grant, and while I should want him to be honored for his services to our country as a soldier, I would not want him to be thought of as only a fighting man who loved war for war's sake. Rather, I would like him to be regarded as a man with a deep sense of duty to his country, fighting to save and preserve it. My father loved peace and hated war, but he loved his country and was devoted to its high purposes. He believed it to be the duty of every able-bodied citizen of the United States to give loyally and promptly his services when his country is attacked and the life of this republic is threatened. My father would not tolerate in the family idle gossip and disagreeable criticism of others. His rule was, if one could not speak kindly and favorably of another, to say nothing. His sense of fairness in judging men and their acts was admirable, free from prejudice and bitterness. Even when one who had unjustly criticized was involved, he would calmly and free from anger decide upon the merits of the case from the facts before him and his attitude of mind if the same were discussed in the family circle where one usually speaks more freely and unreservedly. There were some of the characteristics of my father which made a deep impression on me. In 1874, at the age of 18 years, I married an Englishman named Algernon Sartrees and moved to England. Before the wedding, my father wrote to my future father-in-law, Algernon Sartrees Sr. An attachment seems to have sprung up between these two people, to my astonishment, because I had only looked upon my daughter as a child with a good home, which I did not think of her wishing to quit for years yet. She is my only daughter, and I feel a double interest in her welfare. I hope you will attribute any apparent bluntness to a father's anxiety for the welfare and happiness of an only and much-loved daughter. After my marriage, I returned to America to spend my summers with my parents and remained close to them. In the winter of 1884, I knew my father was unwell, but I did not realize how seriously until I received this letter from him, written on February 16, 1865. Dear Nellie, your letter of the 2nd of February to your mother came 2 or 3 days ago. Algie, my husband's nickname, arrived a few days before and came up and stayed with us until after dinner. All the family are well except me. The sore throat which you recollect I had all the time we were at Long Branch last summer has proven to be a very serious matter. I paid no attention to it until it had been 4 months. I found the doctors considered it a very serious matter. Even now I have to see them twice a day. It has troubled me so much to swallow that I have fallen off nearly 30 pounds. It has only been within the last 2 days that the doctors have been willing to say that the ulcers in my throat are beginning to yield to treatment. It will be a long time yet before I can possibly recover. It would be very hard for me to be confined to the house so long a time if it was not that I have been interested in the work which I had undertaken. It will take several months yet to complete the history of my campaigns. The indications now are the book will be in 2 volumes of about 450 pages each. I give a biography of my life up to the breaking out of the rebellion. If you ever take the time to read it, you will find out what sort of a boy and man I was before you knew me. I do not know whether my book will be interesting to other people or not, but all the publishers want to get it, and I have had larger offers than have ever been made for a book before. Fred helps me greatly in my work. He does all the copying and looks up references for me. We have all been as happy as could be expected considering our great losses and my personal suffering. Philosophers profess to believe that what is for the best. I hope it may prove so with our family. All join me in sending love and kisses to you and all the children. Your affectionate Papa. I traveled to America as soon as possible, arriving by ship 16 days later. Despite my father's condition, he insisted on greeting me at the dock. As he embraced me with tears streaming down his face, I was shocked by the changes in his countenance brought about by illness and suffering. My family was destined to have less than 5 months more with my father, but they were months filled with love and mutual support. Beyond our close circle of family and friends, I know my father was also touched by the many thousands of letters of respect and affectionate support that he received during his illness from his fellow Americans, North and South, and from abroad as well. In closing, I would like to take this opportunity to publicly thank you all for your thoughts and prayers for my father.
Father, I wrote something about Grandpapa. Can I read it to you?
Oh, I'd love to hear it.
My grandparents returned from their world tour in the fall of 1879 when I was 3 years old. I made friends with these grandparents who I did not remember, and attached myself to both. In 1880, I discovered a new heaven and earth where my little brother Ulysses was born. We moved first to New York City, where my grandparents had purchased a new house on East 66th Street, and then to our own house in Morristown, New Jersey. My family also spent time in Elberon, New Jersey, where my grandparents kept a seaside cottage. When visiting there, Grandpapa liked to keep me with him, and we spent much time talking. At times, we went out in his buggy with his fast trotters. I stood between his knees, which steadied me, and held the reins out in front of his hands. In the spring of 1884, Father came home looking very weary, pale, and troubled. Then the next morning, we learned that we hadn't any more money, and we would go and were to go and live with Grandmama and Grandpapa. It was the last summer when I began to hear occasional remarks among the family that Grandpapa was not feeling quite well. The doctor gave him a medicine to gargle with. I assisted in the gargling often and thought the whole thing interesting. Only sorry Grandpapa was not well. Winter came and there were no parties, though Aunt Nellie came from England to stay with us. By spring of this year, Grandpapa was no longer going out. A big, soft leather armchair appeared in his bedroom, and it was said before me that he could no longer sleep lying down. I still enjoyed my privileges. If I was in the sitting room, my chair was drawn close to Grandpapa's, and he would stroke my cheek or hold my hand a little while. In June, Grandpapa appeared very ill. New York City records high temperatures, and the effect on Grandpapa were a source of concern for his doctors. Someone suggested Mount McGregor as a dry, cool place with sweeping views and a small cottage just large enough to hold the family. Grandpapa seemed stronger and was able to take part in the family life around him. He was frequently wheeled down to the overlook, and if I was playing in the garden when he started, I was called to accompany him. I felt very motherly, trotting alongside his bath wagon, chatting as we went, now and then tucking in the corner of his scarf or lap robe. By July, we children saw little of the grown-ups in our family circle who spent their time sitting near Grandpapa or consulting with his doctors. This morning, I was wakened with the news that Grandpapa had a bad night and we must be very quiet. I learned later that morning that Grandpapa was gone. For the first time in my life, I felt heavy with sorrow. I found an opportunity to wander from my nursemaid into the woods behind the cottage. This coat kept line forbade that I go far, but once out of sight, I sat down to digest the great trouble. It was not just a relative who passed out of my world, but a friend and comrade from who I always had understanding, sympathy, and affection. After a while, I dried my tears and searched for a useful activity. I remembered one made wreaths for loved ones who had passed away. I looked for flowers, but there were none in sight in the woods. It suddenly occurred to me the prettiest wreath I had ever made was made of oak leaves. I picked a quantity of leaves, looked them over to see if they were all perfect, and sat down to work. Somehow my deepest went into my task, and though the cottage is now filled with floral tributes from all over the country, my wreath alone lies on his casket.
My name is Frederick Grant. I am the oldest son of the late General Grant, who spent his final weeks here at Grant Cottage, finishing his memoirs to provide for us, his loving family. The outpouring of condolences to our family in this time of mourning has shown to us how much my father meant to this nation. But perhaps it is harder for me to express what my father meant to me. I spent a great deal of time with my father throughout our life. As a boy, I remember him being a patient instructor, teaching me how to ride my horse and swim. He was always gentle with us, his children, always understanding, always encouraging, always generous. I remember following my father to the war. I was just a young boy at the time, but I recall how dedicated my father was to reuniting our nation. I remember being outside of Vicksburg, and my father was so engrossed with his duties. And I remember us both being ill. I had a terrible toothache, and my father had a stomach ailment. But he continued to work as hard as ever. And even in the evenings, I remember him working late, and then when he did go to rest, he would do so on a cot that was torn. And he would stretch his legs over just so he wouldn't fall through the cot, showing how important it was to remain focused, how little consideration he took of himself, and how much consideration he took on the task at hand and the others around him. I remember once my father leaving me on a vessel on the river as he went to the war front. He left me for my own safety. But of course, being the young, rambunctious boy that I was, I found my way off the vessel. And I walked all night, and I remember being lonely and scared. I could hear the sounds of camp and battle in the distance, and I remember coming upon one of the most frightful scenes of my young life. It was a field hospital full of suffering soldiers, and I cowered from it, and I slept under a tree. A fitful, restful, restless night until the morning when one of my father's staff found me and brought me to his headquarters. And of course, I expected my father to be displeased with me. But instead, he was having his morning cup of coffee, and he looked at me and he said, "How did you get here?" And I said, "Well, I walked mostly." And he just looked at me and he said, "Well, I guess you'll do." And at that moment, I think he saw something of himself in me, the determination. And if only I could be just a small fraction of my father's son, I would be proud to be that. If I could emulate just some of the character that I so admired in him, I would be doing well. But throughout my father's career as a soldier, as a president, nothing impressed me as deeply as his final weeks here at the cottage. He did not rebel against his fate. He understood. He tried to keep the worst of it from us, his family. He put on a brave face, but we knew the suffering he was going through for our sake. When I would get despondent and tired, working late, editing the memoirs, all I had to do was look at my father to gain inspiration, to think of how much worse his condition was and what he was going through. And I was inspired to continue the necessary work. The work that he would give his final year to complete for the sake of our family. My father was never so much the soldier or the man as he was in these final weeks, in this final struggle to the end. And I will always remember that. And this place will be left as a memorial, this cottage, to one father's undying love for his family, but also as a testament to love, to the love that his family had for him. May the nation remember my father as he was, as the man who served his country dutifully, as a soldier and as a president. But let them also remember him as a human, as a father and a grandfather, as a husband, and as a man. And one with a character that we can all hope to emulate in our own lives. Thank you.
I'm the Department Historian for the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War up here at Grant Cottage. I'm up McGregor. This monument here was dedicated in 1916 when the Sons of Union Veterans and Grand Army Republic were meeting up in Glens Falls.